Voice of San Diego is a media partner of Pop-Up Magazine, a live magazine created for a stage, screen, and a live audience. Come see the sensational night of true stories featuring your favorite writers, radio producers, and comedians at the Observatory North Park on September 23rd. Tickets and information at popupmagazine.com.
What is it? West Coast correspondent?
Yeah, Western correspondent.
Western correspondent.
Like a cowboy. I like West Coast better. It sounds better, but
All right. Thank you for joining us on the Voice of San Diego podcast in partnership with News Radio 600 Kogo. I'm Andrew Keatts, editor at Voice, and I am joined this week by associate editor and bearded wonder, Jesse Marx.
Greetings and salutations, Andy.
That means that Sarah and Scott are out on vacation. They will be back soon, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on which of them we're referring to. Scott specifically has been busy catching zero fish in a much publicized and failed endeavor on Mission Bay.
How very.
Yes. It was all over Instagram. It was too much, frankly. But coming up on the show today, we have a big endorsement in the Democratic primary for Todd Gloria. Has allowed him to essentially take control of the mayor's race. I was at the Democratic Party on Tuesday night to watch that happen. We'll go over that. We'll talk about what's going on with the North County supervisor seat. There had been a lot of chatter about how the Democrats were going to handle the endorsement there. Jesse's got some details on where that stands. And then in the second half of the show, we're very excited for this. We're going to bring in from The Trace, Alain Stephens. We worked together with The Trace and Alain on a collaboration this week, and he wrote us a piece about San Diego city attorneys leading the way on a specific type of gun control called gun violence restraining orders. So we will talk about that. Let's begin with the mayor's race, right?
Let's do it.
T-Glow is a go, is what's written here, and I have dutifully read it. As of Tuesday night, Assemblyman Todd Gloria has taken control of the mayoral race. He did so by winning the San Diego County Democratic Party's official endorsement. All right, here is why that is so important. It's relatively simple. Mm-hmm. Right now, there are only Democrats running in the mayor's race.
Yeah, and it was a total blowout, right?
Yeah, it was not at all close. And so the only question really going into the night was not whether Councilwoman Barbara Bree or community activist Tasha Williamson were going to be able to get the endorsement themselves. Certainly they wanted it. They asked their supporters to vote for them, but it was pretty well understood that that wasn't going to happen. So instead what they were trying to do was get enough people to vote for no endorsement to keep Todd from getting you have to get 60% of all the votes that are cast in order to get an endorsement, which is a pretty high bar. So they wanted to block him from that, which would have meant that the party had rated them all acceptable, and none of the candidates in that case would have been able to unlock some of the benefits that come with being an endorsed candidate from the party.
And so Bree was expecting that, right? Because at the end of the night, she even had prepared statements that she was handing out to the press.
Yeah, they had print, and unless they brought a printer with them, and we're just like, oh my goodness, I can't believe this has happened. Let's type it up real quick and print it out on my inkjet. Yeah, it seemed that, and beforehand I saw she did like a little impromptu rally ahead of time, and she closed that off talking to her supporters by saying, we're going to win this race no matter what happens tonight, which Todd Gloria was sounding a very different tune at the time of that of the beforehand part.
So explain to us, who are the people in this room? It's the Central Committee. Who are these folks, and why do they get to make this decision?
Yeah, so the Central Committee it's kind of a weird animal. You have people who are independently elected to be on the Central Committee from all of the assembly districts in the county. And then you have members who have votes because either they're elected officials like State Senate Pro Tem Tony Atkins, or people who have kind of votes in perpetuity like ex-board chairs like Jess Durfee and Francine Busby. So they're all in there, and it's kind of this hodgepodge group of elected officials and leaders and people who by virtue of being activists in the Democratic Party for a long time, have ascended to this like quasi-elected role, and they all get a bunch of votes. There was, like 70 some votes were cast at this meeting, and so that's kind of the group. It's an odd little piece of democracy that happens at the Democratic Party.
And so explain to us, Andy, why is that important, right? It's involved with money. It's not just the endorsement itself, but it deals with money now.
Yeah. So I would say also, like, the endorsement relative to other endorsements does just matter, right? Like, most people don't pay any attention to local politics. Yeah. If they do, they bone up a little bit right before they head to vote. They're not reading Voice of San Diego's morning report or politics report on a regular basis.
Even though it's required reading, obviously.
Yeah, even though they should, but they don't necessarily. And so this might just be the one piece of information you pick up in your cursory research. It's like, oh, there's 3 Democrats and one of them got the party's endorsement. I'm a Democrat. That's who I'll be voting for. But even more significantly, parties can spend as much money as they want, as long as they have it, on behalf of their endorsed candidates, so long as they are communicating with other registered Democrats. So basically, the idea is, like, you can't make a campaign finance law that restricts an independent group, a private group, to communicate with its members, which is essentially what a party is. Parties seem to have an elevated status because they're such a central part of our political system. But in their essence, they're not government agencies. They're not official departments of any sort of government. They're just private parties. They're third parties. And so the idea is they can communicate to their members however they want. So what this means is any amount of money that is in the Democratic Party's bank account, they could now spend to send pieces of mail to their registered members and say, vote for Todd Gloria, which is now something that a benefit that Barbara Bray and Tasha Williamson will not have.
So one thing I'm unclear on, there are no Republicans in this race for mayor in San Diego at the time, right?
That is correct.
So why is the party elevating one candidate above another going into the primary? Why don't they just let voters figure it out?
That was the case that some folks at the meeting made, which was, and there were 2 responses. So the case was, first of all, we just passed a law back in 2016 saying that campaigns shouldn't end in a primary, and now they don't. So regardless of this endorsement, no one's going to be able to win in March. This election will be decided next November. One of the specific responses to that was from Kelvin Barrios. He's one of the executive board members, who said, look, we've all heard the rumors that the Republicans may put somebody up. There might be a conservative candidate who gets into this race. And if we don't endorse somebody, they'll see this as a much bigger opportunity. So it's not a foregone conclusion that 2 Democrats are going to advance through the primary. In fact, if we don't endorse, that might give the Republicans some added motivation to get somebody into the race, because then they would be more assured that they could get through the primary.
So
now I don't know that logic actually holds up. I think it might actually be the case that you'd have a better chance of getting 2 Democrats through if they split their votes up a little bit. And as long as there was only 1 Republican, the worst case scenario is you'd still have 1 and 1.
Yeah, so Bree obviously tried to block the endorsement, as you said a second ago, but I wonder if there's not an argument to be made that this could potentially work to her advantage, because now she can make a pitch to, without a Republican candidate in the race, she can go make a pitch to conservatives and conservative groups and say, look, I'm your candidate now. The Democratic Party is going with Gloria, go with me.
Yeah, so I think we had through the spring, when this campaign was very much in its behind the scenes phase, where it was only nerds who pay too close attention to politics were paying attention to it. We had been speculating what direction Bree was going. What was the nature of her campaign? Was she going to move to Gloria's left? Was she going to move to his right? And it seemed to us that she was apprehensive to move to the right. That it seemed like without a Republican in the race, that seemed to be a lane that she could pursue. But for one reason or another, she was hesitant to do that. And I think one explanation for why she might have been hesitant to do that was the fact that this vote was pending, and she wanted to have an opportunity. She's a Democrat. No one has made any allegation that she's anything other than a Democrat in good standing, and has been for her adult life. So she wanted to have a real chance at the endorsement. Now that she doesn't have it, maybe it's time for her to pivot. And she says, well, there still is no Republican in the race. There's a lot of people that have a vested interest in city politics, whether it's the Chamber of Commerce, the Building Industry Association, the California Restaurant Association, the Associated Builders and Contractors, this amalgamation of essentially business-friendly conservative groups that have always been aligned with Republicans, but in the absence of having a Republican to align with, maybe they're up for grabs, and maybe she can, kind of make inroads with them.
So the narrative she's been building for herself is that she's an outsider, right? Even though she sits on the city council, that's how she's been portraying and selling herself. The fact that she didn't get the endorsement, though, it seems to feed into that narrative that I'm still the outsider in the race.
Absolutely, and she hammered that messaging immediately after the vote. She has been setting it up for a while, decrying career politicians and people who run for office after office, or a kind of flash scandal in the last couple of weeks that Todd Gloria has 2 accounts open, one for Assembly 2020 and one for this mayor's race. So she definitely, I think, will lean heavier into that. It's fun, it's kind of an odd thing for somebody who has been here a little while. Barbara Bree, when she announced her city council campaign in 2016, she certainly was emphasizing her business experience. There's no question about that. That's always been part of her political profile. But she was not making any sort of claim to be like disgusted with partisan politics or on the outside of the partisan dynamic, or criticizing people like Council President Todd Gloria, who was on the council when she was running for the council. This is a new thing, and it's odd because it just wasn't that long ago that she was running to city council and then immediately decided to run for mayor.
So it seems like the candidate in the race who actually has a claim to being an outsider is Tasha Williamson.
Yes, Tasha Williamson is without question an outsider. Now she's got a real grassroots campaign that she's putting together. Make no mistake about that. She's raised less than $1,000 in the first 6 months of the year. But she's been present in the media for a few years now. She's been an outspoken activist around criminal justice issues, particularly against minorities, and particularly in southeastern San Diego and National City. So she'll certainly try to elevate those issues. And I think between the two of them, who is more of an outsider, it's certainly Tasha Williamson. I mean, Barbara Bree, before she was a mayoral candidate, she was a well-known political donor to Democrats. She had this well of political capital that had been built up because she had been an ally to the party. She was not on the outside. Okay, so there's this other thing where it's a weird world where like all of the discussions happening in the political world in San Diego are within the Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. The Republicans are like totally on the outside. Eventually, I think in this campaign cycle, we'll have reason to talk about Republicans. But right now, all of the drama is associated with Democrats. Specifically in this case, we're talking now about the North County Coastal Supervisor seat, District 3, which you are covering for us. And the Democratic Party is inching towards making a decision or not making a decision on an endorsement in that race, correct?
That's correct. So last Saturday up in San Marcos, the San Diego County Democratic Party's North Area Caucus, which again is essentially made up of their clubs and their activists and some of their most dedicated grassroots members, they got together to try to figure out who they were going to elevate before the primary for the District 3 supervisors race. So that seat is currently held by Kristen Gaspar, who's a Republican.
Running for re-election.
She's running for re-election, and the Democrats are looking at either Olga Diaz, who is an Escondido City Council woman, as well as Tara Lawson-Remer, who's an academic who used to work for the Obama White House. And they got together on Saturday to discuss who they should elevate, and actually decided that both candidates were acceptable and qualified. So they're going to technically stay neutral in that race.
And so we don't need to get too lost in the procedure here, but this is the since that race covers the North Caucus area, that group of people gets to make a recommendation to the full party.
Yes.
And that recommendation carries a lot of weight, although it doesn't preempt the party from making a different decision. The party could endorse either candidate if they wanted, but the chances of that happening, fair to say, went down because of the sub-area's recommendation, basically.
Yeah, totally. The Central Committee, so the party's top leaders generally tend, I don't want to say rubber stamp, but they generally tend to respect what is being recommended from the area itself, because those are the people who have the most interest in that race. So this recommendation to just accept both candidates as qualified, that's going to be on the consent agenda next month. It's possible that they could pull it and that there could be a discussion on elevating one candidate over another, but the people who are within positions of power have told me it's probably unlikely.
Yeah. And so at stake here is the same thing that we just described with the mayor's race. If one of them got the endorsement, they would be able to unlock this essentially elevated campaign fundraising benefit.
Yes, exactly. So it's the same thing that you discussed a moment ago, right? If you get an early endorsement going into the primary, it's not only going to give you a boost potentially at the polls, but it'll also mean more money. So that's essentially what they were arguing over last week, was who deserved to be recognized going into the primary. And Diaz fell just a couple of votes shy of actually getting the endorsement in multiple rounds, which, if you had been reading the news over the last couple of weeks, may have surprised you. There'd been some consternation over whether or not there was maneuvering behind the scenes potentially to elevate Diaz, and there'd been a report in the Coast News that caused a lot of controversy, but it essentially suggested that certain people within the party were worried that Diaz may have been a shoo-in for that, but it didn't actually turn out to be the case.
Yeah, and so tell us a little bit about Diaz and Tara Lawson-Remer. Tara Lawson-Remer is an academic. Olga Diaz, we should say, used to be a board member at Voice of San Diego. She has resigned her board position because she's running for this office. She's Escondido City Councilwoman. Where have they each sort of consolidated support within the party now that they're sort of running against each other in this race?
So two of probably the most high-profile supporters of Diaz's campaign would be Nathan Fletcher, who is a current supervisor, as well as Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez. They both showed up on Saturday and actually advocated and supported Diaz. And then on the other side of the aisle, or not the aisle, but on the other side of this debate, Tara Lawson-Remer.
There's like a mini aisle on the aisle of the left side of the
right,
aisle.
Just
it's like
factions within the left.
Right.
Although I'm not entirely sure what the differences are between these candidates on policies, but Tara Lawson-Remer had the support of Tony Atkins, which is interesting. So Atkins, who is the Senate pro tem, basically the most powerful Democrat in the Senate in California, showed up and supported Lawson-Remer, but still wasn't enough to push her over the top.
And correct me if I'm wrong, also Tara Lawson-Remer has the support of SEIU.
That's correct.
The
yes.
largest union representing county workers, which is worth noting here, not only because unions are powerful in local politics, and particularly in inter-left squabbles. And this is interesting because SEIU had been aligned with Nathan Fletcher during his campaign in 2018, and that was in its own heated Democrat versus Democrat primary standoff between Fletcher and Lori Saldana, former Assemblywoman Lori Saldana. SEIU sided with Fletcher. They ended up getting him through the primary and eventually elected to the supervisors board, where he has, I think, probably surpassed their expectations in terms of being able to create movement by being the only Democrat on the board. And yet now SEIU and Fletcher find themselves on separate sides of this, the next big supervisors race.
Yeah, true. And why is that?
It is not especially clear to me. It is
neither to me.
Yeah, it's an interesting fight. I don't know. So let's spend a couple minutes. We got a few minutes here before we got a break to get to the second half of the show. Let's spend a couple minutes. Where are the Republicans? What are the Republicans doing in all of these races ahead of 2020?
That's a great question, and especially in a city like San Diego, where you have a current Republican mayor, for the party not to even put up anybody seems bonkers.
It's wild. I mean, not only like the current mayor is a Republican. He was reelected against a Democrat back in 2016. He won his first election, a special election, back in 2013, also against a Democrat. There was a brief period where a Democrat had won, Bob Filner, before he flamed out. And then you've got like 2 decades of Republicans going back before that, right? Like, I mean, the idea of not putting up a candidate is wild, but it's not even just that. It's like all these city council seats, they seem to be missing in action, or they only have one candidate. Kristen Gaspar, it makes sense. She's running for re-election and is presumably a pretty strong candidate for them there. So that seems understandable. But they don't really have anybody running in the South Bay County Supervisor seat. The party seems to be, after punching arguably above its weight in terms of voter registration, and how the county voted in national elections for Democrats for quite a while now, seems to have run out of steam and is now kind of just wilting.
Well, it's also stunning to consider that. So the South Bay seat is going to probably go to a Democrat, right?
Yeah.
It had been held forever by a Republican, but they haven't even put up anyone this time around. So if that seat flips, at the very least, you're going to have a 3-2 dynamic on the Board of Supervisors, 3 Republicans to 2 Democrats, which makes the District 3 race so important, because if Democrats flip that and take it from Kristen Gaspar, then suddenly the Democrats are in control of the county for the first time in ever.
Yeah, which would basically put them in charge of most of local government.
Yeah, exactly.
On the other side of the break, Jesse and I sit down with Alain Stephens from The Trace. That's a nonprofit news team dedicated to reporting on guns and gun violence. And we're going to talk about his latest story that he did in conjunction with us about gun control in San Diego. Stay with us.
Do you want to hear your name or company promoted on the great Voice of San Diego podcast? Naming opportunities are available. Voice of San Diego's audience is informed, educated, and engaged. You can reach thousands of listeners every week through this show. Contact Iris Magid for details. You can reach out at iris@voiceofsandiego.org. That's IRIS@voiceofsandiego.org.
We are back. This week, Jesse and I sat down with Alain Stephens from The Trace. We talked about gun violence restraining orders. It's a very specific type of gun control measure that has become increasingly popular across the country, and which San Diego is without question a leader on. That's largely due to City Attorney Maura Elliott, who has embraced the measure far more than anyone else in the state of California. So, you wrote a story for us this week. It's been doing some pretty good traffic, and we're stoked about that. It's called "San Diego is Showing California How to Use Its Red Flag Law." We'll get to that in a second, but first, I want you to tell us a little bit about your gig over at The Trace.
Yeah, so I'm their Western correspondent. Essentially, I cover everything west of the Mississippi. The Trace, though, yeah, we cover pretty much all things gun. So whether it's, mass shootings or, policy making, I do a lot of coverage on the gun industry, firearms trafficking, ATF law enforcement. And also we do some solutions-based reporting. So, what's working, what policies work, what policies don't. And so this story I did for you guys is definitely kind of under that purview of like a solutions-based story.
Yeah, this might be a grim thought, but I was going to say that you've had a busy couple weeks on the gun beat here in the Western United States. The grim part, maybe it's not actually all that exceptional of a couple week time period, but you've had a run of stories here. You've been covering a bunch of stuff. Tell us about it.
Yeah. I mean, no, this has been, even for someone who like covers guns and stuff all the time. Essentially, we had Gilroy, we had El Paso, and then we had Dayton, and it's all happened in an 8 day time period. Yeah, it seems like 8 months as much as I've been working, and but yeah, we had it was like something like 30 something people died in all these separate mass shootings that happened across the country, and 2 of those, since I'm the Western correspondent, fell under my purview to report on. So with the Gilroy shooting, I think the thing that we kind of zoned in on was that the gun had came from essentially Nevada, right? So like our neighboring state. And that is something that as like a gun reporter and in this world, you see a lot of the guns in California being used in crimes actually are transported over from Arizona, that are transported over from these neighboring states with looser gun laws. And this case was kind of one of those classic things where we saw this weapon move from one state over to another and was used in a crime. And then by the time we kind of tackled that story, El Paso happened, and that one, I was looking at this guy's manifesto, and one of the things that I decided to look into was the ammunition that this guy was seeking, and he was seeking a bullet, he said, was called the 8M3 round. And that kind of stood out to me because it's not a very common ammunition. It's actually ammunition that was developed in the Chechen War by the Russian military, and it had been imported over into the United States and was highly sought after by the shooting community because it was this round that would fragment upon impact and create devastating damage. So a lot of people saw it as this perfect self-defense round for, an AK-47 type weapon. It actually stopped being imported in for a while, but due to kind of popular demand in the shooting community, it would ramp back up. And this shooter in El Paso had sought this out because he wanted to get maximum killing power. And it was kind of interesting too, because one of the importers of this ammunition was a small company in Texas, and they had ended up getting a Senate committee actually demanded the Department of Treasury investigate them because they believe they were working with Russian state oligarchs to get this ammunition over, and that they were violating U.S. sanctions. So it's this kind of crazy mesh of how all these things work.
So it's not just that it's rare; it's actually a restricted ammunition.
So it's rare. There isn't a ton of restrictions with ammunition, but what was restricted was the fact that they were essentially that this company had been doing business with people that were on the U.S. sanctions list, and they had done that and kind of got the small batch of ammunition over that was particularly lethal. And this is something that the shooter sought out. So it was kind of this interesting story in the mix of all these other elements in that shooting.
So whenever we've had these high-profile mass shootings, there's a few days of discussing what sorts of policy solutions we might actually be able to pursue. And increasingly in the last few years, one of those solutions that's been put forward is red flag laws.
Right.
Talk. So California has a red flag law. San Diego uses it a lot.
Yeah.
That's what you wrote about. Tell us basically what is a red flag law?
So a red flag law is essentially this preemptive policing measure. It's the idea. Essentially, it kind of answers this question: what if we could take the gun out of the shooter's hands before they ever pull the trigger? And this was something that really kind of got national attention after Parkland, because in that case, the shooter had made some statements and people had went to law enforcement and nothing happened, and then you had this major shooting occur. So people started looking at this and saying, okay, well, what if there's a way that, this person may not have violated a crime per se yet, but they've said some things on Facebook, they've said some things to some family members, they've had some indications that they are a threat to others or themselves. can we go in and just temporarily get that gun out of their hands and then maybe get that person some treatment or some help or a cooling off period, and then later on they can get their gun back from the courts and possibly kind of prevent a shooting or a suicide altogether. California, though, is kind of this experimental state because we actually had this conversation before the rest of the nation with the Isla Vista shootings. And that's what sparked our red flag law here, which was passed in 2014. It went into effect in 2016. And it wasn't until about 2017 that people started using them. And San Diego leads the pack by far as issuing out these orders and kind of disarming people.
And so the technical name for them is gun violence restraining orders.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. So gun violence restraining orders, GVROs is kind of what they're referred to. And so we started pulling records actually. And you brought this up to me. You're kind of like, this is something that we see San Diego City Attorney Mar Elliott kind of touting and saying, hey, we're doing this. So I went to the California Department of Justice. I pulled the 2018 records and to see how many were being issued. And I saw that Los Angeles County had 30 and San Francisco had 1, and then San Diego had 185. So it was way more than everyone else. So I was like, all right, maybe we should look into this.
So, Alain, there's no way of actually knowing whether we've prevented a suicide or a mass shooting, right? I mean, that's really difficult. But officials in San Diego have made that claim. And I remember in your piece, you also pointed to, I think it was in the Annals of Internal Medicine, which is obviously one of my favorites and probably one of your favorites too. But it made the same claim. So how do officials make that claim seriously, and how do you potentially verify that?
So, one of the things is that, so when I approached this story, I was actually very skeptical. I used to do a lot of criminal justice reporting. So anytime I see a law or something like that that's being used, my first question is this being abused? Is this being overused perhaps? And so when I contacted Mara Elliott's office, I was actually kind of like, what are we really seeing here? And what I come to find is that they have instated a pretty high burden of proof. They actually told me, and this is something that doesn't really go in this story, but I think it's important to say, they told me that they reject about a third of the orders that are requested because that burden of proof is so high. And then when you look at some of these cases, it's very clear and present danger, right? It's I open up the piece with a story about a guy who goes into his job. He tells his coworkers that he actually admires the Las Vegas shooter, that he had plans to do something similar. So all of these things are kind of collected as evidence for police, and the police go to the courts. And it's hard to kind of say that this stopped a shooter. And I mean, for all intensive purposes, we have no clue what these people are kind of doing later on. We may have only delayed a shooting, theoretically. But when you kind of see some of these cases, they're making sure that that they're kind of hitting this legal standard. And you see that most of the time, I wouldn't even call it a red flag law as much as it's almost red flags, because they're of 3 or 4 different elements where you're like, okay, this guy's really upset. He's really heated. He has a weapon. He's mentioned a weapon. He's mentioned a plan. Same with another case I bring up, which was a suicide. Guy shows photos to his family holding a gun to his head. And the police intervene. And so you kind of see these types of things and you're like, wow, yeah, if you can't prove it, but man, it looks like, they definitely stopped something.
So what's the specific procedure? You said the city attorney's office said that they had they reject about a third of the requests. So what's the chain of command essentially?
Yeah, so the chain of command, so the California law works that essentially a police officer or an immediate family member can petition for a GVRO. And it's an ex parte order, meaning that, one party essentially is the only party that needs to be knowledgeable. They do this on purpose, essentially. It wouldn't kind of really make a lot of sense for them to say, we're going to go get a GVRO on you as an individual who is exhibiting these signs, because you may run and hand off your guns to a friend or hide your guns or whatever. So they kind of do this. They take it to court and they say, listen, we have all these statements. And like when you look at the records, it's actually overwhelmingly police doing this. Police are a little bit more well-versed in kind of figuring out like, okay, we're going to take the witness statements. We're going to write down all the reports and stuff, and they take it and they request one of these.
But theoretically, a family member could do it.
Theoretically, a family member could do it. Yeah. And right now there's actually a bill that's kind of working its way through by Assemblymember Phil Ting that's actually going to try to expand who can request these to school workers and employers. So you go to the court, you request one of these, the police show up, and if it's granted, and the police show up and they remove your guns, essentially temporarily. Right. And then it can be extended for up to a year with a court proceeding. And this time that individual who's having their guns being taken away, they'll actually get to go to court and they can get representation, or they can argue why their guns shouldn't be taken away, et cetera, et cetera. So it kind of goes through all of these types of processes where you can,
And so it's a judge who ultimately grants or rejects the order.
Right.
These are relatively new. Is there case law, or do we anticipate there becoming case law that establishes what the specific standard that a judge is looking to meet is? Right. I mean, I think, and this is where we kind of get into this issue and that I was really harping on about abuse, right? Because this does raise a lot of questions. So I actually talked to Michael Schwartz, who is the president of the San Diego Gun Owners.
Yeah, the San Diego Gun Owners organization. They're like a pro Second Amendment rights organization, and they've become kind of like the de facto watchdogs on this. And they had actually talked to Elliott's office early on, saying, "Listen, we want you to create these kind of bullet point standards and list them out." So we kind of know what they are. And he claims that Elliott's office had nothing of the sort, and that the conversation between his organization and Elliott's office in these kind of early days when they're formulating the GVRO program here kind of like broke down. And when I talked to Elliott's office, I get the feeling that like they have a very competent team and they're very knowledgeable about this, and they're showing kind of like a great deal of restraint because they know that they're under scrutiny from people like Schwartz, from people like us, like the media, who are asking all these questions. But at the same time, like, it does kind of raise concerns because they are going across the state, kind of training these other law enforcement entities and stuff on how to use them. And it raises this kind of question mark on, okay, well, there's a competent team here in San Diego, but how is this going to work in, say, Oceanside, right? How is this going to work where you don't have the legal know-how or the restraint, and what's there to stop, your neighbor who doesn't like you for not mowing your grass, saying he said some wild stuff to me and I want his guns taken away. And I think that raises like a super, important question about how this is going to play out. And when you see some of these numbers from other counties like Los Angeles and San Francisco that have way more gun violence than San Diego does, I feel that part of those numbers, the reason why they're so low is that because there are concerns about, we don't want to overstep and infringe on someone's Second Amendment rights.
So with all of these eyes on these restraining orders, these watchdogs you mentioned, as well as the media, has anyone been able to dispute any one of these orders at any point in time? So
this is kind of interesting. So as far as the individual who's having their weapons essentially taken away from them, so they could go out and get legal representation during the court proceedings. The other thing that they can do is they can actually go and show the court that they had remedied the situation. So, in one case, there is a person who had a discharge of a weapon, and they actually went to the court and they said, listen, like I went to a gunsmith, or, I've locked the weapon up, or I've taken all of these things to kind of remedy the situation. Can I have my gun back? And the court can grant them and say, yeah. Actually, in the opening story where we have this potential mass shooter, the San Diego City Attorney's Office actually reviewed that after a year and decided not to renew, and gave the person their weapon back. When I talked to them, one of the things that the office is really trying to build this as is kind of more of as a temporary cooling off measure. It's almost like law enforcement of like yesteryear, where they're kind of like, we're going to take this away from you until you could show us that you're a little bit responsible, that you're a little bit cooled down.
Wild West justice.
Almost
like,
Wild West
cool?
justice.
You guys cool?
Like, you guys
right.
cool? Everyone just calm down.
Holster your weapons, go back to the casino.
And so when you look at the first 100 gun violence restraining orders that the city issued, it's like the large majority of them are actually related to domestic violence and stalking, right? So you have these kind of nuanced scenarios where you have these heated breakups and divorces, and so the way they see it is you have this period where eventually divorce will be settled. These people will move their separate ways, like they'll calm down and cool off and stuff like that. But while this turmoil is going on, let's go ahead and get the gun out of here temporarily until these issues can be settled, until the divorce is finalized, till emotions and tempers kind of chill out. And then we can get that gun back into their hands when people are, when cooler heads have prevailed.
So the way the political alignment is today, the support for gun control measures like this and others typically comes from the left. It is also the case that support for criminal justice reforms and those sorts of tempers on the power of law enforcement also come from the left.
Right.
Has there been any sort of, that you're aware of, recognition from criminal justice advocates that this has the potential to, as you mentioned at the beginning, be the sort of thing that, if it were to be abused, could fall more harshly on lower income people, minorities, that sort of thing, that, maybe in your disgruntled neighbor situation, maybe that's a situation that somebody is more apt to bring if that there's somebody unlike them who's their neighbor.
Right. And I mean, like, and this is something that, of course, like I was concerned about, right? Because, like, anytime I hear about gun laws, right, one of the harsh
lower
realities,
threshold for intervention from law enforcement.
Right, exactly. And like anytime you hear about gun laws, like we have this national conversation going on about gun laws and stuff like that, and we're like, we need to institute new laws, and this is all kind of done at the catalyst of like a white male mass shooter, but in action, the laws and the people incarcerated for illegal possession of firearms and these types of things are like overwhelmingly minorities. Like we're the ones who are kind of getting the brunt of that enforcement action.
Emily Bazelon has a new book out right now, Incarcerated, that talks about how the zero tolerance gun laws in New York have disproportionately, overwhelmingly been,
and like, and then kind of
and
venturing off into this, and this is just something that I encounter in my reporting because I deal a lot with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. One of the things that you see is that, in the early 90s, they created something called Trigger Lock Major. And Trigger Lock Major is this kind of federal initiative that was like, listen, we want to go after local criminals, people who violated, local laws, but we want to get them on federal weapons charges. So what they'll do is they'll kind of piggyback onto local law enforcement and say, listen, like your guy that you've got arrested for this assault or whatever, like we can hit him with a federal weapons charge, send him to a federal prison. And when you look at what the ATF's convictions are right now, like what they're actually putting man years and sentences on people, it's overwhelmingly under this umbrella of Trigger Lock Major, right? And I've talked to ATF agents and they're like, a lot of them don't even like this because they see it as one man, one gun, low-hanging fruit. All these people are minorities, and they're not going after arms traffickers or bad gun stores or these kind of like really professionalized criminals who are moving a lot of guns.
Militias that are stockpiling
Exactly.
weapons.
And they're like, we're not doing that as much as going after these kind of guys who had a gun with them while they're drug dealing. So like going back to this, yeah, I'm like super concerned about that. And, the ACLU in a couple of other states outside of California had brought this up before, saying like we're somewhat concerned about these red flag laws and if they're disproportionately affecting like the wrong people and people who don't have legal defense and can they be abused. So, I think that it does kind of raise like a lot of concerns and questions about, is this a political ploy? Is this the right thing to do? Is this going to be disenfranchising communities who are already disenfranchised? So I think that kind of is yet to be said since we're such in this experimental phase with it right now.
Alain Stephens, he's a reporter with Trace. You can see his story on voiceofsandiego.org. Direct link is in the show notes. Thanks for listening to the Voice of San Diego podcast, the most popular public affairs podcast recorded in downtown San Diego. Tickets are on sale now for PolitiFest. That's happening this October at the University of San Diego. This year, we're going to have a full day dedicated to housing and transportation. There will be panels, live podcasts, community conversations, and more. You can check that out and get your tickets at politifest.org. I'm Andrew Keatts, assistant editor, who was joined this week by Jesse Marx, associate editor. This show is produced by Nate John, Adriana Haldiz, and Megan Wood. We'll talk to you next week.